On the way to a family reunion, my husband went pale and whispered, "Turn the car around now." I was stunned. "Why? Just turn around, please." I trusted him, and it saved us. When I found out why, I never saw my parents the same way again. We were cruising down Route 15 on a perfect Saturday afternoon, windows cracked just enough to let in the crisp October air that carried the scent of burning leaves and apple orchards. I had been chattering about the butterscotch cookies I'd baked that morning, Dad's favorite, and how excited I was to see everyone at the annual family gathering. The radio was playing some oldies station, and I was humming along to California Dreamin' when I noticed David's hands clenching into fists on his lap. His coffee mug sat untouched in the cup holder, the steam long since dissipated, and there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there when we'd left our apartment in Hartford 20 minutes earlier. That's when his phone buzzed against the dashboard, and I watched the color drain from his face as he read whatever message had just come through. David's jaw went rigid, and he started checking the rearview mirror obsessively, like someone was tailing us down this quiet suburban road. The sweet vanilla scent from my cookie tin suddenly felt overwhelming in our small Honda Civic. "Turn the car around now," he whispered, his voice carrying an urgency that made my stomach clench with dread. When I stammered out, "Why?" he wouldn't meet my eyes, just kept staring at that phone screen like it contained a death sentence. "Just turn around, please," he repeated. And something in his tone, raw and desperate, made me signal for the next exit without asking another question. I executed a U-turn at the next intersection, my hands trembling slightly on the wheel as I headed us back toward home instead of my childhood house, where my entire extended family was waiting. David's phone kept buzzing against the dashboard, call after call that he ignored while staring straight ahead. "Don't answer that," he said sharply when I reached for it out of instinct, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. The silence between us grew thick and suffocating, broken only by the persistent ringtone and the rhythmic thunk of our tires hitting the seams in the pavement. As we pulled into our apartment complex, David finally turned to me with eyes that held a mixture of protection and devastation. "I'll explain everything tomorrow morning," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But tonight, you have to trust me about the warning message I just received." The weight in those words told me that whatever had made him panic was about to shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Growing up in West Hartford, I'd been the quintessential good daughter, honor roll student, softball captain, the kind of kid who brought home boyfriends that made parents beam with pride. And when I brought David Chase home 3 years ago, I thought I'd finally achieved that dream. David was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: brilliant, compassionate, steady as granite, and completely devoted to making me laugh even on my worst days. He taught high school algebra and coached the academic decathlon team, spending his evenings helping struggling kids understand concepts that had stumped them for months. But I'll be honest, my parents' initial reaction wasn't exactly the enthusiastic embrace I'd hoped for. They were polite, certainly, asking basic questions about his work, and nodding at appropriate moments when he shared stories about his students' achievements. But there was a subtle distance in their interactions, a careful politeness that felt more like they were interviewing a contractor than welcoming a potential son-in-law. Mom would make comments about how teaching is such noble work, in a tone that somehow made nobility sound like a consolation prize. Dad would grunt non-committally when David shared his thoughts on current events, then quickly change the subject to safer topics like the weather. Our family gatherings included the usual mix of relatives and longtime family friends, people like the Morrisons, who'd been part of our social circle since I was little. Jake Morrison would sometimes join these get-togethers when he was visiting from wherever his law career had taken him lately, and he was always perfectly polite, the kind of well-mannered guy who remembered to ask about your job and complimented Mom's cooking. I never thought much about Jake's presence at these events. He'd been floating around family functions since we were kids, just part of the familiar landscape of my childhood. After 6 months of persistent effort on my part, countless conversations about David's wonderful qualities, his devotion to his students, his plans for our future together, My parents finally seemed to come around. I think the turning point was when my Aunt Helen made some pointed comments at Easter dinner about how some parents need to let their adult children make their own choices, delivered with the kind of social pressure that my image-conscious parents couldn't ignore. Suddenly, Mom started including David in holiday planning, asking his preferences for menu items. Dad began inviting him to watch Yankees games and even started asking his opinion on investment strategies. Over the past few months, especially, there'd been a noticeable shift in my parents' behavior that had filled me with relief and gratitude. They'd become almost enthusiastic about including David in family activities, remembering his birthday with thoughtful gifts, and genuinely seeming to light up when we walked through their front door together. Mom had started referring to him as our David when talking to her friends, and Dad had even invited him to join his weekly poker games with the neighborhood guys. When we announced our engagement, they threw us a beautiful celebration dinner, and Dad made a heartfelt toast about how lucky they were to have David joining the family. But lately, something had felt different about their enthusiasm. More intense, more urgent somehow. Mom had been calling more frequently than usual, always with invitations to family events or suggestions for weekend activities. Just last week, she'd called 3 times in 2 days about today's family gathering, making sure we'd be there and asking repeatedly what time we'd arrive. "It's going to be such a special day," she'd said, her voice carrying an excitement that seemed disproportionate to a typical family barbecue. Dad had been equally insistent, mentioning several times how important it was that we be there. Despite their apparent acceptance and growing enthusiasm, I couldn't shake a persistent feeling that something remained unsettled beneath the surface. Maybe it was the way conversations sometimes paused when David left the room, or how quickly topics changed when certain subjects came up. There were moments when I caught my parents exchanging glances that I couldn't quite interpret, looks that seemed to carry some kind of understanding I wasn't privy to. David had never mentioned feeling unwelcome, but sometimes I wondered if he sensed the same subtle undercurrent I did. A feeling that, despite all the warm words and inclusive gestures, we were still somehow being evaluated, still somehow on trial. As I watched David's face that night, something in his careful smile made my chest tighten with a fear I couldn't name. The next morning I found David sitting at our kitchen table with untouched scrambled eggs growing cold on his plate, dark circles under his eyes that told me he'd spent the night staring at the ceiling. The morning sun streaming through our apartment windows cast everything in harsh relief, highlighting the stress lines around his mouth and the way his hands shook slightly as he lifted his coffee mug. The scent of the French vanilla coffee I'd made filled the small space, mixing with the lingering aroma of the cinnamon rolls I'd attempted to bake as a peace offering, though neither of us had touched those either. "I need you to trust the process," he said quietly, his voice carrying that careful tone he used with students who were on the verge of an emotional breakdown. "I promise I'll explain everything in a few minutes. But first I need you to promise me something." The intensity in his dark brown eyes made my chest tighten with anxiety. I nodded, though my fingers were trembling as I gripped my own mug. "Don't contact your parents for the next 24 hours. No calls, no texts, nothing. Can you do that for me?" The request seemed harmless enough, if slightly odd, and David had never asked me to do anything that didn't eventually make perfect sense. Over the next hour, he dropped small hints that made the hair on my arms stand up. He mentioned some things he'd noticed about family dynamics lately, little patterns that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but apparently formed some kind of troubling picture when viewed together. My phone kept lighting up with calls from home. Mom, then Dad, then Mom again, each call lasting just long enough to leave what I assumed were increasingly frantic voicemails. David watched each notification with a grim expression and gently reminded me of my promise not to answer. "You need to prepare mentally," he said at one point, setting down his mug with deliberate care, "because what I'm about to reveal tomorrow is going to be very disturbing." I spent the rest of that day in a state of suspended animation, pacing around our small apartment like a caged animal while David worked quietly at his laptop. Every surface got wiped down twice. Every book on our shelves got straightened and re-straightened, and I reorganized our spice rack 3 times just to keep my hands busy. The afternoon stretched endlessly, punctuated by the persistent buzzing of my phone. Calls that David insisted I let go to voicemail with increasingly urgent explanations about why they were panicking. By early evening, a new worry had begun gnawing at me. What if David was hiding something much bigger than family drama? The way he kept glancing at his phone, the careful way he chose his words, the fact that he seemed to know exactly what my parents were thinking. It all felt too orchestrated, too planned. For the first time since I'd known him, I found myself wondering if I could trust the man I'd married. By evening, when David promised he'd explain everything the next morning but warned that the warning message I received would change everything, I felt like I was balanced on the edge of a cliff, waiting for someone to either pull me back to safety or give me the push that would send me tumbling into the unknown. When David finally turned his laptop screen toward me the following morning, what I saw made my world tilt on its axis in a way I never could have prepared for. The first thing he showed me was a text message he'd received from my cousin Mike, sent just minutes before we would have arrived at the family gathering. "Don't come to family gathering today. Mom and Dad set up something with Jake. It's going to be ugly." The timestamp showed it had arrived at exactly 2:47 p.m., right when David had gone pale and demanded we turn around. Mike had followed up that initial warning with a series of increasingly detailed messages that painted a picture so disturbing I could barely process it. He explained that he'd accidentally overheard my parents on a phone call that morning, planning what they called an intervention with Jake Morrison. According to what Mike had heard, they'd coordinated with Jake's family to have him show up unexpectedly at the gathering, creating a situation where I'd be forced to choose between David and Jake in front of our entire extended family. The plan, as Mike understood it, was to publicly embarrass David to the point where I'd realize I'd settled for someone beneath my social class. But Mike's revelations went far deeper than just that day's setup. He admitted that he'd been noticing a pattern for months, David being forgotten on invitation lists, my parents making convenient excuses for why he couldn't join certain family activities, subtle comments about how David was nice but not going anywhere. Mike had initially dismissed these as random oversights, but hearing that phone conversation made him realize it was all deliberate. He'd been hearing my parents spread negative comments about David during family calls, always couched as concern, but consistently undermining his character and our relationship. Mike's final message was the most devastating. He'd overheard my parents discussing how today's plan was meant to be the final push, to get me to wake up and see what I could have. They'd apparently been building toward this moment for months, systematically excluding David from family events while positioning Jake as the better alternative. The coordination with Jake's family had been going on since the beginning of our relationship, with both sets of parents convinced they knew better than their adult children about matters of the heart. Mike ended his messages by saying he'd tried to warn Jake too, but Jake had said he was just going along to make his parents happy, and didn't seem to understand the full scope of what was planned. As the final message disappeared from the screen, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from shock anymore, but from something much more dangerous. When I called my mother that afternoon, my entire body was vibrating with a rage so pure it felt like electricity running through my veins. The familiar warmth in her voice when she answered, "Skylar, sweetheart, we were so worried yesterday," felt like sandpaper against my raw nerves now that I knew what lay beneath that maternal concern. I took a shuddering breath and launched directly into my confrontation, referencing the specific incidents Mike had described. "I know about all of it, Mom. The setup with Jake, the phone calls, every single thing you've been planning." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. When she finally spoke, her voice had transformed entirely. Gone was the sweet, concerned mother, replaced by someone defensive and calculating who sounded like a stranger wearing my mom's face. She tried to downplay everything at first, claiming I'd misunderstood what Mike had overheard, that family discussions had been taken out of context by someone looking to cause trouble. But when I started mentioning specific details, the coordination with Jake's family, the planned public embarrassment, the systematic exclusion of David from family events, I could practically hear her realize that denial was pointless. That's when Dad got on the line, and his approach was completely different from Mom's panicked backpedaling. Instead of denying what they'd done, he went on the offensive, insisting they'd only been looking out for my best interests, and that Jake was simply a better long-term choice for someone with my background and potential. His voice carried that patronizing tone I remembered from childhood lectures about choosing better friends or working harder in school, as if I were still 10 years old and incapable of making adult decisions. Jake has been waiting patiently, Mom chimed in from the background, her voice taking on a wheedling quality that made my skin crawl. He's always cared about you, and this would make everything so much easier for everyone. The conversation devolved rapidly from there, with both parents taking turns trying to convince me that they knew what was best, and that I'd thank them someday for preventing me from making a terrible mistake. They spoke about my marriage like it was a rebellious phase I'd eventually outgrow, like David was some inappropriate college boyfriend, rather than the man I'd chosen to build my life with. The call ended when Dad said, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat, "We know what's best for you, Skylar. This isn't over." The menace in those words made it clear that even after being caught red-handed in their manipulation, they had absolutely no intention of backing down from their campaign to control my life. That evening, as David and I sat in our living room surrounded by printouts of Mike's messages and notes about everything we'd discovered, I felt a strange sense of clarity settling over me like fog lifting to reveal the landscape beneath. The initial shock and hurt were still there, sharp and immediate, but underneath those raw emotions was something much stronger. A fierce determination to protect the life we'd built together from people who'd proven they'd stop at nothing to tear it down. The decision to cut them off completely wasn't born of spite or revenge. It was simple self-preservation, like removing an infected splinter before it could cause blood poisoning. I spent hours that night crafting a formal letter that laid out exactly what we knew and what our boundaries would be going forward. The letter was professionally worded but unambiguous, explaining that we would have no contact with them until they acknowledged their wrongdoing and demonstrated genuine respect for our marriage and our choices. I sent copies not just to my parents, but to my siblings and key family members, not to embarrass anyone, but to ensure that the truth was documented before my parents could spin their own version of events or paint themselves as the injured parties. The response from my extended family was swift and more supportive than I'd dared to hope. My brother called within 2 hours, absolutely furious on my behalf, and admitting he'd always felt something was off about how our parents talked about David when he wasn't around to defend himself. My cousin Rachel, who was planning her own wedding, called to ask point blank if our parents had tried to interfere with her relationship too. And when she really thought about it, she realized they'd been making subtle but persistent comments about her fiancé's prospects and his suitability for the family. One by one, family members began reaching out with their own stories of my parents' controlling behavior, painting a picture of people who'd been manipulating everyone's relationships for years. Meanwhile, my parents launched into full damage control mode, calling relatives and trying to spread their version of events where David was the villain who'd turned their daughter against them and poisoned her mind with lies. They showed up unannounced at my brother's house, demanding he talk sense into me and convince me to come home before it's too late. They even had the audacity to contact my workplace, claiming they were concerned about my mental health and asking my supervisor if I seemed stable and rational lately. But their increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control only reinforced that we'd made the right decision. But as I slid the new deadbolt into place on our apartment door, I wondered if cutting them out completely would be enough, or if they'd find other ways to reach me. 8 months later, The consequences of their actions had rippled through their social circle in ways I don't think they could have anticipated when they first started their campaign against David. Jake's family, mortified by their unwitting participation in what they now understood was a coordinated scheme to break up my marriage, had completely distanced themselves from my parents, ending a friendship that had lasted over 3 decades. The country club crowd, initially sympathetic to what they saw as concerned parents trying to help their misguided daughter, gradually turned cold as more details emerged about the extent and duration of the manipulation. My parents found themselves increasingly isolated from their usual social activities, excluded from dinner parties and golf outings, as people realized the toxic role they'd played in their own daughter's life. The extended family had overwhelmingly sided with David and me, especially after several cousins and family friends came forward with their own stories of my parents' interference in their relationships over the years. Family gatherings continued without my parents' presence, and surprisingly, everyone seemed more relaxed and genuine without the constant undercurrent of judgment and manipulation that had always made family time feel like navigating a minefield. My brother hosted Christmas that year, and for the first time in decades, the conversation flowed naturally and warmly, free from the subtle criticisms and pointed suggestions that had always hung over our celebrations like a dark cloud. The friendship between our family and Jake's family had collapsed entirely, creating an awkward social situation that rippled through their entire circle of longtime friends. Mrs. Morrison, humiliated by the revelation that she'd been actively participating in a scheme to destroy someone's marriage, had apparently told several mutual friends about my parents' behavior, leading to further social isolation. Jake himself had been mortified to learn he'd been used as an unwitting weapon against my marriage, and according to my brother, he'd actually reached out to apologize for his role in the whole situation, though I never responded to his attempts at contact. Eventually, my parents did reach out with what appeared to be a genuine apology. Not the defensive justification I'd expected, but a carefully written letter that acknowledged specific wrongdoings and took full responsibility for the damage they'd caused to our family. They asked for the chance to rebuild our relationship, admitting they'd been completely wrong about David and expressing sincere regret for the years they'd wasted trying to control my choices instead of supporting my happiness. The letter was everything I'd hoped to hear from them, but by then, too much trust had been broken for things to simply return to normal. We did eventually agree to limited contact, with strict boundaries about their involvement in our lives and explicit consequences if they ever tried to interfere again. They apologized to David personally, acknowledging the unfair treatment he'd endured and expressing what seemed like genuine respect for the man I'd chosen to marry. Our relationship now is cordial, but careful. We see them at major holidays, exchange polite conversation about safe topics, and maintain the appearance of a functional family. But the easy intimacy and unconditional trust of my childhood is gone forever, replaced by a cautious politeness that serves as a constant reminder of what we lost when they chose their social expectations over their daughter's happiness. Sometimes I wonder if completely cutting them off was too harsh a response. But then I look at David, at the confidence in his posture now that he no longer has to constantly prove his worth, at the peace in his eyes knowing he's finally accepted as part of our family, and I know we made the only choice that would preserve our marriage and our sanity. The question that keeps me awake some nights isn't whether I was too hard on them, but how many other families are living this same lie right now? How many parents think they know better than their adult children about love and life choices? At what point does parental concern cross the line into destructive manipulation? And when is it not just acceptable but necessary to choose the family you've created over the family you were born into?